Welcome to the Catholic Commission for Social Justice and the Archdiocese Ministry for Migrants and Refugees, fifth episode of Ask Why. And ask why what? Ask why there is inequity within society. And today I'm really excited to have on our show with us the wonderful Gillian Goddard of the Alliance for Rural Communities. And I'm particularly excited for today's episode because at the end of the day, we have to look for solutions in society. And Gillian and the ARC have certainly done this at a very at an intervention point where they're looking at how to best empower communities, especially coming out of this COVID-19 period where so many have faced job losses, so many have found that they are struggling even to put food on the table. So this is a really exciting conversation to have. We're going to be talking about food sustainability and how best we can empower our communities. So Gillian, welcome and thank you to us for coming on Ask Why. So let me take a minute to introduce the Alliance of Rural Communities. The Alliance of Rural Communities of Trinidad and Tobago is a non-profit organization founded in 2014 and made up of residents of rural and semi-rural communities and their urban allies. ARC is made up of a core advisory team of individuals and affiliated rural community companies, as well as our supportive customer base. Using a holistic strategy, ARC supports rural communities throughout the Caribbean to play an expanded role in their national affairs and to move towards solid financial inclusion in regional economics. They have now developed a tried and tested approach to ensure wealth distribution and environmentally sustainable income generation in financially excluded rural Caribbean communities. Wow, that is major problem solving at its best. So let me take a moment to say welcome, Gillian. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
We are so excited to really speak on this because there's so much to unpack, so let's begin. And my first question is, first off, who is the ARC? How did it come about? What is the genesis of this very potent and powerful growing community? I can't even call it an organization. I feel like it's coming from the roots and almost like a solid tree that is just going to grow and flourish and spread. So wow, thank you for coming on board.
Please tell us about it. Thanks for having me here. And when you said those words, I felt a little concept of a solid tree, because I would say that we are a tree that's developing, but we have heavy winds to contend with. So it's not as straightforward. We're growing on soil that has not been fertile for quite a while. And the system in which we are growing has factors that are not ideal. So I think it's important not to be naive about the system that we are working with in 2021, that it's a system that has been problematic for centuries. And so whatever we put in place now, one of the things that we have to be is somewhat patient. Even though we don't have time to dilly-dally in a certain way, we can't be naive about the age and the complexity of the challenges that we are dealing with in trying to create holistic spaces and to shift the system to something that actually functions in a very different way. So ARC kind of came about by accident. I would say that there were many different vantage points from which you can describe it. But from my vantage point, my partner and I both had been farming for a long time, both had long experience with activism and communities, and we're now starting to make chocolate. And so when we started making chocolate in a very kind of low-key guerrilla style chocolate making, which is actually possible in the 2000s, which wasn't possible 15 years ago, we realized that it would make sense for us to share our skills with other farmers that we knew. We were kind of shocked actually that it was actually possible to make chocolate with such an inexpensive setup. And of course, this is not the bonbons from fancy stores, but basic chocolate. We had cocoa here, we had access to sugar, we had access to some amount of cocoa butter. And so the ingredients were there. And in many communities, there were cocoa trees that had been sitting without anyone harvesting for decades. So we called up a friend and we said, hey, why don't you pull together 4 young adults or 5 young adults, and we will teach them what we are learning. And that's actually how the beginning part of ARC started. Now, of course, when you have an organization that's as complex as it is now, there are many vantage points because there are things which got incorporated into ARC from which I don't have the founding perspective. So soon after we began to teach chocolate making, I was asked by an organization to teach a different community chocolate making. So it already started speeding up. This was in about 2014 going into 2015. We had no idea of ARC at that point. We were just basically doing skills transfer. And as we began to do skills transfer and we added on another community, we realized that without distribution networks, if you are in a non-connected community to the shelf space, that your ability to actually get on a shelf is minimal. And so bit by bit, we started adding on different activities. And at that point, we decided that we were going to give ourselves a name. And that's the name we took.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to clarify. When you say shelf space, do you mean actual distribution in groceries and
sales rated?
Right. Well, so, you know, because this is, I'm going to let you finish, but this is because I feel like you seem so humble with it, but your product, I see it all over the place. I see it in Massey. I see it in a lot of boutique retail outlets. So
it's about 60 stores.
Yes. It's actually, so, okay, please continue. I have this problem of interrupting and I apologize.
No, that's part of Trinidad culture. So feel very comfortable. So when we realized that okay, so let me back up a little bit. What we say we use as our model is a tropical rainforest. And when I get stuck around business or anything like that, I look to the forest with which I'm somewhat familiar. And I look to see how is that system healing itself? How is that system coping with trauma, with disruption, with a fire, with a flood, with a landslide? And so many times when we've gotten a bit stuck, honestly, that's how we've gotten unstuck. Because none of us went to business school.
I have to interrupt you again. That just totally blew my mind. That is incredible thinking. Please continue.
Yeah. When you think about utilizing a forest model, I mean, that's a type of philosophy, I would say. And most land-based cultures that existed and exist on this planet, that's their philosophy. The natural world is much more complex than human interactions and human communities. So if you're going to look for solution, why should you look to something that is much more simplistic and much more fraught with challenges and lack of evolution into new systems and constantly challenged by changing conditions? Why should you look at a human community? Honestly, it's where I look when the problems are basic. But for complexity, the forest, the natural world, the natural systems, they are worth imitating. So that's really our.
I mean, it is literally, obviously we are looking at life through a Catholic lens, but this is exactly that. It is, for us, we could say that it is God, because nature is God's creation.
I want to say it again, because I think sometimes when people see something that has been going on for a couple of years, they don't see themselves in it. And I wanted to be clear that this was not started with any intention outside of a philosophical base that everyone deserves a good life, and everyone includes the Guti, the running water, the person running down the street or riding a bicycle, that we all deserve a good life. And so the action on which that then gets expressed is based on a philosophy. And so ARC is an organization that we constantly talk about ideas, or about why, or about how. It's not just about, yes, we do. I'm big into spreadsheets. I love spreadsheets. They are like, I absolutely enjoy doing spreadsheets, but that's not anything but action based on a way of thinking. So ARC started with just 2 people. And it's not impossible that this type of action takes place in many different spheres, as it does. But ARC is, I think, one of the ways that we have functioned well is that we have attempted to create something that can be replicated. Because in times like this, you need a speed up. So it's almost like, you know, when you have a landslide, if you are going to be able to utilize that land, you have to speed up what you do. And you have to come together with thinking, and you have to create something. And if you're having a lot of landslides, you have to come up with a system that's going to work with the landslides or with the rain to make sure that you're not constantly out there digging up dirt that fell down. So we have attempted to create a replicable system. It's still in the making, but it has allowed us to be able to share our knowledge, our information, and our access fairly rapidly, considering what the design of the system is originally. So we started off just transferring skills, and then we supported a community to create their own company, their own chocolate company in one village. That was Grassroots Chocolate Company. And then soon after, we did the same thing in Grand Riviere, and they have a chocolate company, and in the Bishan Kush area. And then we actually got one started in Tobago, but that one's on hold for now. And then we went to St. Lucia, and we were able to support 2 companies to start there. And then right now we are in the process of teaching chocolate making classes to farmers and incorporating other chocolate makers in 7 countries across Africa. And we've now started collaborating with another chocolate maker in Jamaica who's helping with that process, and getting something started in Dominica also. And then we are collaborating with a couple of African heritage chocolate makers in the US also. And so we've supported the creation of something called the Cross-Atlantic Chocolate Collaborative. So that's about to launch its first product in a couple of days. So that's why this week has been so busy.
Well, that's actually pretty incredible, because that is 7 years of work, and you're already a global entity. And it started off as a skill sharing venture, and is organically, for want of a better word, just branched into community empowerment through chocolate. And as you know, just to inform our general viewers here, Trinidad and Tobago has some of the highest quality cocoa in the world. And we've seen the extent of the full range of local chocolate makers that we have now. And as you were calling those communities, I literally saw the packs of chocolate, because that was brilliant branding and packaging that you did there. You know, the Brasa Seco brand, the Grand Riviere.
But that was Above Group. That was Marlon Darbo and Aji Archer. And so they did a very NGO style in the sense of how much we paid them, how they worked with us. I mean, we got a lot of community care in the beginning, and we still do. So the truth is that Trinidad has had a history of community care for
Mhm.
centuries, even through all of the disruptions and the greed and the upheavals. There has always been community care. I think that sometimes we think it's not there, but it's, as I said, it's like a tree growing in high wind. There's a lot of system challenge to community care. And so part of what we are creating with this organization is how do you create an organization that operates in a commercial area that is clear that without income generation, activism in most of our communities cannot happen because people require funds to actually live comfortably and to not be exposed to excessive violence. And so you have to have that commercial sphere. But at the same time, we can decide what the culture is in which we are doing this. So, you know, honestly, I could have started a business. I could have hired everybody who currently has their company work. I could have made this into my chocolate company. But I don't actually believe that the way that we are conducting business in terms of private ownership or state ownership is a good idea. I think what we have set up, this system isn't working. And we have clear evidence that it's not working. So how do you shift people from a position that something is not working, especially if they are benefiting from it? And so in a certain way, the change that is happening now, it's not really going to come from those who have benefited from a pathological system. So what it means is that resources, support, skill sharing has to be able to be directed to people who are not benefiting. Because the motivation to change the system is not going to come from those who are getting advantages based on it.
So I want to ask you a question here, because I agree with you. The status quo is always preserved by those that it's working for. And right now, the reality is it is working for a certain smaller, narrowing segment, but richer segment than we've seen before. You know, we live in a world where we have the billionaires now, and we see it, you know, literally, we could call it a lack of grounding, because these billionaires like Elon Musk, like Richard Branson, are shooting up to the skies. And there was that recent article by the UN, the head of the UN actually condemning them spending so much money when we have so much world poverty. But what I like about your system is that you're so spot on. You're empowering the grassroots communities, and that's where the shift will happen. So I really wanted to ask, how are you seeing, what was the reception like when you went into these grassroots communities?
Okay, so maybe that would be helped, the understanding of that, by me explaining a little bit how I see myself. So I know enough history to know that Trinidad is a place where pretty much everyone had severe economic and material deprivation until about the 1950s or 1960s. So we are a nation of recent upward mobility. And so part of what was important for me was to really examine the system in which I was growing up and see what happens to make us think that's not our community. What takes place to make us feel that that is not my community? It is my community. I am from a family that, you know, my generation, except for brief periods in the past, has been living in historical poverty for centuries. So I think part of the challenge with us is that there is no grassroots, because we all are. We have recent upward mobility. And I think that to reframe our understanding, the word middle class is not a word I would use for myself. Yes, I went to prestige school. Yes, because of the oil boom time, when I was a child, my parents scraped what they could and they sent us to a paid school for particular reasons. And we can talk more about why would they need to do that. So the system itself was pathological, and the path that I personally would have taken through it would have been one of relative advantage but that does not erase hundreds of years. And so part of what, let's take a forest analogy, right? So if you have a forest and you have a very large tree that is taking all the water, shading out all the other plants, in the end, that tree will not be able to survive because the area will get depleted. You need other trees to create rainfall. You need other ecosystems to have things like pollinators. So there is a whole bunch of stuff that in a forest, it's very, very clear that there's no such thing as individual well-being, that everything in there relies on something else, that the mycelium of the fungi in the ground that are like their internet that send messages across miles in seconds to tell other trees what's going on or other plants, that is actually the way that humans function. But I think that there is some human developed culture that it's myths, and those myths about who we are, how we are, what we are, have led us to make a lot of confused decisions based on individual understandings rather than communal understandings. So I had to return there because from coming through a paid primary school and going to what in Trinidad we call a prestige school, I was indoctrinated with the understanding of individuality, not of communality. There was competition. Some people got good grades, other people didn't. You were visible if you got grades, you weren't visible if you didn't. You were categorized and you were given value and status. And that is inherently something, if you study indigenous groups who have survived for tens of thousands of years, they don't allow that to happen. They have systems in place that actually return communality whenever there is a challenge of individuality. And there are enough films out there now about individual cultures that are indigenous, land-based is the word that I would use, that actually understand that they're living on a land. You're living on a land. That's already not a myth. That's how it is. And first, you got to understand that. So for me, returning to my communities of history to participate in passing back what I had received is just basic human behavior. Because humans function, when we function well, as part of an ecosystem of humans and other living beings, and that's what living beings do. They participate in community life. And even if one gets a bit more sunlight here, it doesn't say, okay, well, I got this sunlight, so I'm only going to give mangoes to my progeny. I'm only going to let my small amount of birds come and pollinate from here. I'm not going to be free for all. This is now, there's a fence around me now, and I'm only going to decide who gets to get the resources. That's not how it works. So I think in terms of us as cultures, because we really have to differentiate between ourselves as living beings and ourselves as cultures. So you have a culture, and a culture is basically a bunch of behaviors based on a philosophy. And what is the philosophy? And that is where, for me, I had to return to that. It took me decades. So I would not say that when I was 23 years old, I realized some of the things I'm talking to you about now. And I don't think it had anything to do with my age. It had to do with the fact that I was in a system that had a certain philosophy, that believed in competition, that believed there was hierarchy in human beings. Some were better than others, and there was hierarchy in life. Some life was better than other life. And so that took me a long time because I had to really fight through a system. So by the time I am engaging with my community to participate in sharing skills, because there's skill sharing. I'm not going anywhere and pouring out all of this wonderful stuff that I have gotten. I am receiving while I give. There are things that my family forgot because we were pulled out of St. Vincent and Barbados and, you know, the typical Trinidad scenario, come from somewhere, dragged here, perhaps mixed with some blood of people who've been here for a long time. But basically, having lost a lot of the skills and the knowledge and the stories and the culture that's really required for a long-lived culture. And so inside of communities who live closer to land-based culture, the tension is stronger. And so I get to see and learn and engage with a different level of generosity, a different level of, this is not about an idyllic life, but it is about seeing a culture that is not the culture that I was taught was desirable. I am not necessarily in the same boat as most NGOs, because I am temporarily as one of the directors of the Alliance of Rural Communities, and one of our main objectives is to ensure that leadership skills to run the organization are rapidly transferred. And that's why it already has happened, because ARC is made up of many arms now. So one of the things that we became very clear about quite early was that creating an organization that was based on basically monocultural thinking, that you could actually just take chocolate and that was enough, is not healthy for communities in any case. And so very soon after, we began to incorporate other plants. And so ARC is actually made up of one arm that does wholesale distribution of cocoa and chocolate products in Trinidad, and we also do some in the US. We also have a retail arm where we have a shop, a small shop and cafe in St. Augustine. We're moving in the next week. So we will put out the information soon about our new location. But we have been doing an online shop on a very low-key level for about 4 years. We have a website called chocolaterebellion.com. And basically, it's based on the premise that there was a particular role that we were expected to play as the Global South during the colonial period, where we would provide raw materials, which would be processed and used to enrich ex-colonies. And Chocolate Rebellion, that's not how we are functioning. We are processing our raw materials as we desire. And we are also participating in creating retail spaces that we own, that we are able to highlight what we offer in order to deal with the issue of the challenge of shelf space, which any new entrepreneur or group will tell you that's a major factor in whether you survive or not.
Yeah.
An online platform allows you some wiggle room around that, but people still enjoy shopping in 3D spaces. And so it is important to have access to that. So what else does Chocolate Rebellion Space do? We are actually selling chocolates and cocoa products from other what's called origin countries, which is countries that grow cocoa, but they also make chocolate. So chocolate that is made in a country that grows cocoa is called origin chocolate, generally. So utilizing the cocoa from their country. So we are just relaunching, and we will be selling the chocolate and cocoa products from about 15 countries.
Wow.
All in the Global South, and bit by bit increasing our reach. We also sell, we have an online grocery, so we sell organic produce, and I use that word simply because I have never farmed any other way than organic. And the people within our network, that is how we farm. And we have something called a PGS, a participatory guarantee scheme, where we meet as farmers, we exchange advice, and we also are about to start going to each other's farms to monitor, to ensure that there is no chemical use, and to ensure that we are using best practices, even more rigorous than organic certification, third-party wise would require. We have a tourism arm alongside. So we started off with cocoa and chocolate tourism, but we have people in the group, because the group is extensive. We have bird banders, we have people who are skilled in hiking, we have people who are skilled in building ancient ways of doing things. And so we have a tourism arm, and then we also have a cafe. So we do all local catering. So we have, what's that?
Can I join your group?
We are open to many people. So we have people who participate in many ways. As part of our PGS, we actually meet with our customers, and they are able to come on the farms with us if they'd like to come. That's a recent addition to the group, but we've always been very customer friendly. So our customers, we consider customers part of community. So we are about to start an environmental book club online, a reading club through ARC. So we are a system, as you said before. You know, we are not a monoculture. We believe in polyculture. And what happened that was a miracle during COVID is that pre-COVID, we had crossed the 1 million mark as an organization. It's really well spread, so nobody's getting rich off of it, but a lot of people are getting their basic revenue, at least a supplementation of their basic revenue net. And we have these 4 different parts: the cocoa and chocolate products, cocoa and chocolate tourism, the organic and online marketplace, and the all local catering. And when COVID hit and everybody had to close their stores, it meant that our cocoa and chocolate revenue plummeted, but our online shop and organic produce shot right up. So we actually met our income goals the next year, but with a completely different set of parameters.
Wow.
Yeah, so it made us realize it made sense. We didn't expect it was COVID, but we could see the system was under strain. If you're a farmer, you have to learn to create some sort of predictions of the future. And all that a prediction is that you're utilizing information, a lot of information, and your experience, and you're putting those together to see where the trends are going. So as many farmers can see that the system is under strain, and it's not necessarily going to be able to function. We are not surprised when things like COVID happen. So even though we did not think it would necessarily be in the form of a pandemic, we could see that the feedback loops had been damaged and that we were in a position like a bungee cord, right? So we've been able to postpone feedback loops for quite a while, just like a farmer does using a lot of chemicals on poor soil. You can postpone the feedback loop for a while, but after 3 years, that land is not going to produce for you. Right. So that pull, we could feel it. And so we were able to just very quickly, like they say in like business terms, pivot. And we were able to increase our revenue from the produce and the online shop. And then that made up for the contraction in the complete removal of tourism, which was about 20% of our revenue, went down to 2%. And we started doing online tours this year. So we've been doing tours in the US of our cocoa estates and chocolate making. At the beginning of COVID, there would have been some of the people in the various chocolate sectors that would have been reluctant to shift from where they were. But because we have different entities, and because whether we liked it or not, people were not going to the grocery stores, they were not buying chocolate, they were not coming on tours. And so even if you want to convince yourself of a different form of reality, reality is what it is. So we had the ability, because we had these little units, to scale some up, to contract others, to shift the management resources, to move what we were doing on social media. So because we have even though we have a team that does make some amount of strategic decisions, it's a very decentralized organization.
You know, and I think that's the key point there. The empowerment throughout the entire organization. And as you rightly said, you were able to scale up, scale down according to need very easily and, you know, quickly too. You were able to respond to market demand like that, which
we had to, yeah. And we were able to, like right now, you know, lockdown has lifted. It's a very interesting time to be putting products out because there is minimal predictability. And so our online shop would expand whenever there was a lockdown, and it would contract whenever there wasn't a lockdown. And because we are selling about 43% of our business now, from 8% is produce. Produce does not wait for humans to lockdown or not lockdown. You have to plan it out months or years in advance. And so it's really valuable for us to be able to be forward thinkers and to try to create retail space ourselves, because otherwise things spoil. And so part of what we developed out of necessity, which is very, very common in rural communities in the old way that Trinidad functioned, thrift was a very important concept. And so the techniques to utilize things so that they didn't spoil and you had to throw them away we have been trying to reintegrate those into our organization. So what do you do if you have bananas? So we would dry the bananas, or we would make a chutney. So our produce arm, fortunately, has a link to our processing arm. And so we can actually take cassava and turn it into bammies or cassava bread. And we can peel things, and we don't use single-use plastic. So everything is wrapped. If we freeze something, it's wrapped in a Sahari leaf or a banana leaf. And we deliver in cardboard boxes, and we only use home compostable materials in our packaging.
Can I just say something? You know, you began as an organization that really focused on skill sharing. But to me, what I would say, and again, it was with regards to agriculture, but definitely with regards to your business acumen, there's certainly a model that is emerging here. I mean, would you be willing to, would that be something that you would look at, the skill sharing of the business model, your business entity that has organically, again, want for a better word, just developed around you with
Yeah, so we do. So in other words, each chocolate company is its own business. So that means that there has had to be the sharing of skills and the development together, okay? Because I have run several businesses, but I never ran anything this complex. So it's clear that it's not, you know, me, superwoman, flying in through the door with skills already in place, like tick, 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 tick. No, it wasn't like that. We are growing together. So we do a lot. I mean, Zoom has been a godsend because we are scattered, right? So we have interaction in communities in Grand Riviere. We have had interaction from farmers in Matlot, in Beach, in Couche, in Rio Claro, in Cora, in North Coast, and the way the transport systems, the roads are in Trinidad, some of those places, like if you could just go over the back of the valley, it's not that hard, but we have to come out of our valleys, go across the main road, go back into the valley. So Zoom from COVID has completely allowed us to transform. I would have to give credit to the fact that that type of remote communication has definitely speeded up our ability to pivot and to create new strategy, because prior to that, it was much harder. And definitely the Cross-Atlantic Chocolate Collaborative would have been near impossible. I tried it before, even outside of ARC, but now we have the information from ARC and we write everything down. We treat our model as a franchise, which is what all activists should be doing, because the knowledge is required so much now to be spread rapidly that if you come up with something that's working, you should have it systematized as though you are a franchise, so that it made it possible that we could actually go into St. Lucia and in 4 days they could have a chocolate company in their community. Now, there are some ongoing things that are not as easy to systematize because there are specifics. St. Lucia's economy prior to COVID they had over 1 million visitors a year. Trinidad, nothing like that. So the chocolate opportunities in the two places are very different. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have, I think our GDP per capita hovers around like 15,000 to 18,000 US per capita per year. Jamaica, it's about, I think, 6,000. In Uganda, it's 800. So even if you take the same skills model,
right,
the way the skills are shared and the resources are moved in your community will depend on what your current situation is. And that, once again, for somebody who farms or who looks at the forest, that's kind of common sense. Because the way you would spread pollen in the dry season, you wouldn't spread it that way in the wet season. You would respond to the time and to what is going on at that moment. You would not create a rigid structure that requires the same response day in, day out, year in, year out.
I love that you've franchised your model too. As you rightly said, you know, this is that level of understanding your worth and your value is that cultural shift that you're living it, but I think we need to really appreciate about ourselves, because certainly you've produced a global model here. And
Yeah.
this is something that is actively happening right now. It's so exciting. So coming out of COVID-19, and going back to this idea of how the general public can now adapt these certain ideas, because food sustainability is something that we're all worried about, especially with the significant job losses. But interestingly enough, your organization has thrived in these times. And we could say that maybe it is because you looked to nature and you are agile and you saw the writing was on the wall and you were able to put the systems into place so that you flourish no matter what. So,
right. Well, I know that the conversation was supposed to be about climate change, right? So let me just put a little plug in there for climate change. We're running around acting like if we are making the changes. Now, we have created something that the natural world is creating the changes, right? Climate change is not us going and turning the dial a certain way. The natural world is doing certain things, creating certain limits, operating in a particular way that then has repercussions on our lives. So we are in a system. And I think one of the ways that the replicated model works is that in a way, the system of global oppression is the same everywhere. It's not as though in one place women are getting much higher salaries than men, and in another place, men are getting much higher salaries than women. Pretty much all over the world, the same situation exists. So it means that it makes it possible for us to put solutions in place that might be environmentally specific, but that are still dealing with the same fundamental issue. And so in a way, because the oppression has become so homogeneous, because a lot of it, what we're dealing with currently, and I'm not speaking about 1200 or whatever, but in 2021, what we are dealing with is stuff that in particular speeded up in the 1500s. And so it was coming from one direction, it was one philosophy, it was one approach. And so even though it led to multiple versions of a feedback loop, it's still the same trigger. And so that in a way makes it a little easier from my perspective as an activist for us to collaborate, for us to work together, because even if you're working across issues, you actually have the same problem. But that is where I find that around this issue, there's a very fragmented response. And because it's not really, for me, based on philosophy, I honestly think that if you don't have a fundamental philosophy, it's very difficult to have effective action.
So, Gillian, I wanted to now ask you, what do you think that trigger thing is? What's the root, in your opinion? Because I love hearing everyone's perspectives, because what do you think is that core root thing that is the source of the oppression that we're all
well, I mean, okay, on a superficial level, I think Western Europe colonization and the culture that was in place at the time, that was then exported all over the world, which was a culture of stratification and consolidation of power with the means to exert the power. Because you have to have both of those things. You can have power, but if you don't have the means, whether it's philosophical, whether it's material, to exert the power, then there's only so far you can go with it. And I mean, I read a lot of history. So I read a lot of books from the US, when the native population, which was a land-based population in general, came across a population that was civilization-based. And those are, to me, two contrasting philosophies. So if your philosophy is centered on the role of the human versus your philosophy centered on the role of the entire living community, you end up with different conclusions. And you end up with a different culture and a different set of behaviors and a different set of rules. And so it's not going to give the same result. And the long-lived cultures who were able to steward the world in a certain way, they were not tiny cultures. I mean, the Amazon, now that there are tools to measure it, it's clear that there were millions of people living in the Amazon. but their philosophy of how they lived there meant that you could enter in the Amazon as an unfamiliar person, and you would actually think it was an untouched forest. You would not see the hand of humans there, because the way that the human culture operated was with a veneration of the non-human culture and an imitation of it. And yes, a speeding up of it, a potentiation of it, in the same way that many animals do. Bachaks use natural rules, and they do certain things to improve their lives, but imitating what is already in the system. So Bachaks are gardeners. I don't know if you know that. So they don't actually eat what they collect, but they feed that to a group of fungi, and then they eat the product of the fungi. So they are utilizing an imitation, a way that their system works. It's a real system that they have, and they are gardeners because they are not directly foraging. They are foraging to feed that to something that they grow. So in the natural world, you can see different species potentiating their own experience. And the land-based cultures, humans did that all the time. They would strengthen the soil, they would choose, even cocoa. When you look at where cocoa originally came from, there was obviously some manipulation genetically. So if you're in a place for 50,000 years, what are you gonna do? You're going to play around, you're gonna experiment, you will have scientists, you will have people who are experimenters, you will have innovators. So it's just that all of it is done on a different platform and foundation than if you are doing it all thinking about humans.
Wow. And, you know, can we end on that note, because we have run out of time, but and to give this a Catholic lens, I want to actually, what you have said there is, you, without even realizing it, you've spoken to exactly what Pope Francis is saying now. We need to move away from the individualistic nature that we have propagated, the throwaway culture, as he puts it. And we need to now see ourselves as we were originally supposed to be, stewards of creation and not having dominion over the earth. And what you said there about the Bachaks, I find it, you know, I immediately think we as humans, we forget how sophisticated and how intelligent nature is. And we're simply aspects of that. We are not here to have dominion. We are not superior in any way. We are created alongside. So, oh my gosh, Gillian, thank you so much for this conversation. Please come back, join forces with the Catholic Commission for Social Justice. There's so much synergy here. Your work is phenomenal. And thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of the Catholic Commission for Social Justice, we'd like to thank ARC for joining us. Please keep us informed on all your work, and take care, everyone. Have a good evening. Tune in next week for episode 6 of Ask Why. Bye, everyone.
Bye.